trying to determine if it should be lower. I think maybe it should be a little bit lower. I'm not sure. It's okay. It's fine. A new book starting tonight. Yes, we will be sharing, Brian. Cher. We'll be sharing. Cher part 1. Share the memoir part 1. We waited so long for this to come out, and I had this on my wish list, and John got this for me. And you guys know I love Cher. You love Cher. So, and this is part 1. I don't know where it ends off as, although I was just looking at, because Georgia on My Mind is the name of the first chapter. There's a little preface, and I'll read. And there's an author's note, and I was like, what is that? And it was just, this memoir is based on my sometimes imperfect memory. In this memoir, I refer to my son Chaz as Chas, because remember, she was originally a daughter, Chastity, so she probably calls her Chastity. Like sometimes you call me Still. Okay. The name he went by during the years covered in this book. Chaz has granted his blessing for this usage. In the next volume, at the appropriate point, I will refer to my son as Chaz. So, that goes to show you that through this book hasn't transitioned yet. So it would be, and there's pictures. I saw there's like picture breaks here and throughout. There's like 3 picture breaks. So when you hear me talking about things like Georgia on My Mind, I think that's her mother's name. So, which is such a pretty name. So I'm sure there'll be pictures of her mother. But that's it. Like, I haven't read anything else, just that author's note in the title of the first chapter. I got a bow in my hair of the it's like a plaid. My dress is all bunched up. And then I put on some red heels then to go with the red in the bow. A note about the physical therapy. I am done. They said if I ever want to go back, or if I feel I need to go back, I can go back, talk to my doctor. But I do not want to go back. They're like, how do you feel it's helped you? And anyway, so yeah, I'm glad to be done with that. Okay. Got my coffee there. I just made cinnamon. Well, it's gingerbread with cinnamon, one of those little Starbucks pods that Johnny sent to me before. So I'm trying to figure where I want to lay down. Probably this way. Ugh, this light's in. I'm just trying to make sure my skirt's not running up too high when I lay down. We are trying, of course, to follow the rules. Of course, I'm another platform like Wink Wink Saturday Night. Not gonna worry about that, but here we follow the rules. Okay, so everybody gets settled in, cozy up. This should be fun. We waited so long for her to write this book, but I have a feeling it'll be well worth waiting for. Pulling you guys up. Doesn't it put that song in your mind or in your head? Arthur, are you gonna sing that song tomorrow? There you go. Yeah. Sorry, just right now. That's good. What other social networks? Just the one right now, and I can't post that here. So, okay. Let us begin. Why are my legs so long? Things go up, but that's okay. That's okay. I just pay attention. The song Georgia on My Mind by Ray Charles, or at least he sang it. I don't know if he wrote it. Okay, preface. Los Angeles, summer 1956. I'm gonna get a little closer to you guys. Get a little bit closer. Staring at the television, open-mouthed, I let my peanut butter and jelly sandwich drop onto the plate in my lap as chills ran up and down my body. Home alone after school, I was sitting cross-legged, my favorite position still, on the floor in front of the TV, enjoying the peace and quiet and watching my favorite show, American Bandstand. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Ray Charles, Dick Clark announced as the camera panned to a handsome man in sunglasses sitting at a piano. Georgia, Georgia, he began, and I burst into tears. I couldn't believe he was singing a song about my mom. As tears dripped onto my sandwich, I never felt more connected to anything in my life. Ray Charles's voice and the melody seemed to express exactly how I felt. It took me weeks to get over seeing him sing, and in some ways I never did. But then, someone whose songs I first heard on the radio blew a hole in my understanding of the world, and I was never ever the same. As I stared at the TV with my mom watching The Ed Sullivan Show, a popular young singer named Elvis Presley filled the screen. Mom and I were two of the 60... maybe I'll... million Americans who witnessed that historic performance in September 1956. Even though Elvis was dressed quite traditionally, that Sunday night he looked and moved differently than any performer I'd ever seen. He began by singing Don't Be Cruel, and by the time he broke into Love Me Tender, I felt as if he was singing only to me. I wanted to jump right into the TV and be Elvis. When I heard a year later that he was giving a concert at the Pan Pacific Auditorium in Los Angeles, I rushed home with stars in my 11-year-old eyes. Mom, Elvis is going to be at the Pan Pacific. Can we go, please? I was convinced that I had to be there. Secretly, I thought that he would spot me in the crowd and pick me, although I'm sure that's what every girl thought. Luckily for me, my 31-year-old mother was as crazy about Elvis as I was, a fact that impressed my friends because Their moms didn't approve of his raw sexuality. To this day, I don't know where she found the money, but somehow Georgia did. Mom and I dressed up and made our way into town, more like sisters than mother and daughter. Feeling the tension grow the closer we got to the Fairfax district, we soon found ourselves caught up in a pushing mob of 9,000 noisy girls. We were swept inside the auditorium on a wave of pure adrenaline. Our folding seats were about halfway back in the audience, but that was fine by me. Looking around at all the girls, gazing in anticipation at the darkened stage, I could feel my heart pounding inside my flat little chest, a sensation I was to become all too familiar with later in life. The stage was dark, but when the spotlights hit him, Elvis was there and he was magic. There was a roar from the crowd that was like nothing I had ever heard. An explosion of flash bulbs went off. I only wished I brought our little Kodak brownie. Elvis was standing there in his famous gold suit, which was shimmering and changing color in the spotlights. He was so handsome with that amazing smile and lustrous black hair, exactly the same color as mine. Everyone around us jumped to their feet and started screaming so hysterically that we could hardly hear a word of Heartbreak Hotel. But boy, we could see his moves, the way he gyrated his hips and shook his legs so that they quivered. Not content with making as much noise as they could, the girls began jumping up onto their chairs for a better view, which meant that from then on, we could only see Elvis's head and shoulders. Being in the middle of that shrieking crowd was like being caught up in a massive swivel hips tidal wave, swept along with the hysteria toward the stage. I had no idea why everyone was acting so insane. I was too young to get that part of it, truthfully, but if I had been 3 years older and my mom had been 3 years younger, we would have fainted. It was the most exciting experience I'd ever had because I knew that I wanted to be on that stage in the spotlight one day too. When I looked over at my mother, she was down for the count. We were both mesmerized. She looked so beautiful, dressed in some amazing outfit that of all the girls in the place, including me, I felt sure that Elvis would have picked her. Pressing my mouth to her ear so that she could hear, I cut my hand over it and yelled, "Mom, can we stand in our seats and scream too?" "Yes," she replied, grinning like a teenager and taking off her high heels. "Come on, let's do it." So we did, straining on our tiptoes to see him. Glowing with happiness, I tried to work out if Elvis would be too old to marry me by the time I was grown, so that he could sing to me every day. Dreaming of being Miss Presley, I couldn't stop talking to Mom about Elvis for weeks as I floated around on a gold lame cloud. So now we're on chapter 1. I was just trying to remember what my first concert was. The truth is, I haven't been to that many concerts in my life. I haven't been I haven't had anybody to go with. And although, you know what? One of the few concerts I've seen in my life was Cher in Vegas. But my first concert, I think it was at an amusement park, and they had some country singers there. And so you sit in like the like benches, like I think it was like Six Flags from where I grew up in Massachusetts. So anyway, I don't remember. I couldn't probably see the people very well. I don't remember wanting to be them. I imagine a lot of kids see the performer and want to be like them when they grow up. I think I would when I would watch like on TV, like American Idol and stuff. Like, oh, I want to be like that. Okay, chapter 1, Georgia on my mind. Somewhere in the back of a drawer in my mother's house was hidden a small black and white photograph of me that I never laid eyes on. She couldn't bring herself to share it with me and broke down each time it was even mentioned. To the day she died, the pain of the moment that picture was taken in 1947 was as raw as ever, and the woman, later known as Georgia Holt, couldn't bear to be reminded of it. From what little I learned, the tiny square of celluloid depicted me as a baby, clinging unhappily to the rails of my crib in a Catholic children's home in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It was taken through a small viewing window by my tearful 20-year-old mom, at that time still Jackie Jean, her birth name, a singer from rural Arkansas, working for tips as a waitress in an all-night diner. She'd come to see me on one of her weekly visits to the home where my father had placed me before he took off on his latest money-making scheme. I still can't believe he left her in Scranton with a baby, no money, and few skills, never to return. Oh, thank you, Jerry. The nuns took in two types of waifs: the strays, teenage girls who strayed from the path of virtue, and infants rescued from evil surroundings. I guess I fell into the latter category. The sisters charged my mother $4.50 a week, and with the tips she made at the diner, she was just able to make ends meet. Often, when I think of my family history, it sounds like the opening of a Dickens novel, but it's true. Ours was a sad, strange story of Southern folk coming from nothing and carving out a life after the Great Depression. It wasn't pretty, and it was never easy. Every day was a fight for survival for most of my family going back generations. Resilience is in my DNA. In another photograph Mom kept for years, her maternal grandparents and their children were captured on the front porch of their funky ass log cabin in the backwoods of Missouri, flanked by their hound dog. You can tell how hard their life was by the state of the cabin and the look on my grandfather's face. Not one person in the picture was smiling, least of all my great grandfather, Isaac Gully, a railroad worker with a bushy beard. He once snapped the neck of my grandmother's beloved pet kitten. Oh my God! After it got into their bucket of milk. Oh my God! They were so poor. I don't think I could forgive anyone like snapping the neck of your pet. Oh my God. Um, yeah, they were so poor there wasn't anything that could be spared, not even for a kitten. She remembered that every day for the rest of her life because she loved that kitten so much and even taught it tricks, including how to push a doll's buggy. Aww. That reminds me of you, Terry. I wish I knew more about my great grandmother, Margaret, who wore her hair in long braids and was the woman in her community who would go into the forest and gather herbs for medicine. With knowledge inherited from her own mother and the local Native Americans, or original people, as I now know they prefer to be called, she knew which herbs and roots to pick from the forest to make natural cures. She also knew some of the tribal dances, which she taught to her children, with the psychic ability that also ran in my family. She sometimes had premonitions in her dreams, and in 1923 had a vivid nightmare that her husband blew up and then fell to the ground in a million tiny pieces like confetti. It was so real to her that the following day she gathered her children around to tell them. By nightfall, her husband Isaac was dead. Isaac blew up stumps for the railroad for a living, and that day he lit too close on the dynamite fuse. He was blown sky high in the explosion. Yeah, and I bet their family got literally nothing work for that happening on the job back then. It's like, well, too bad for you. Widowed and penniless, yep. Margaret struggled to feed her family, and when she lost their small farm, she could only afford to keep the two youngest boys, sending the rest to relatives they didn't know. Skinny, shy, and tiny for her 10 years, my grandmother, Linda, oh, I never seen it that way, Linda with a Y, Lynda, had to move in with relatives she hated. To pay for her keep, she was sent to work in a boarding house where one of her chores was to fetch the bread from the local bakery. That's where she met my grandfather, Roy Crouch, a baker's assistant who'd fled an abusive childhood in Oklahoma to work in a cafe owned by his elder sister, Zella, a tall, dignified, and colorful lady everybody adored. In those days, in rural areas, history was passed down orally between generations. It wasn't written. It was the same in my family, so no one seemed to know for sure how old Ray and Linda were when they first met. I was told that Roy was 16 and Linda was 12. Who knows? The second youngest of 9 children, Roy didn't get along with his mother, Laura Bell Green. According to family folklore, Laura Bell was an imposing figure, almost 6 feet tall and part Cherokee. She had a fierce temper and beat her smart-mouthed son with a buggy whip. Despite that, I wish I had known her, as she was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman who passed on her love of music to her children and ultimately to me. Once, when she beat him badly, Roy's sisters, my great aunts Zella and Clara, who doted on their kid brother, carried him to the spring house and dabbed his cuts with a whippet. Desperate to escape, Roy dreamed of becoming an outlaw like Jesse James or Pretty Boy Floyd. But then he met Grandma Linda and fell for the 12-year-old farm girl with no life experience. After a moonlit swim together, she was pregnant and gave birth at the age of 13. Oh my God! To my mother, Jackie Jean, in 1926. Could you imagine? Could you imagine? How do you even raise something? In 1926, that's from when her mother was born. Okay. Linda was too young to cope with the baby, and Roy, tired of her complaining, turned to other women and the illegal whiskey known as moonshine during the Prohibition years. When he was drunk, he sometimes beat her, continuing the cycle of violence that began when he was small. Growing up, I heard that he was arrested more than 30 times for violence and drunkenness, and having known him from childhood when he visited us in the summer, I could well believe it. After attacking the local sheriff, who tried to arrest him for bootlegging, Roy went on the run with Linda and their baby, living the outlaw life he'd always dreamed of. They could only find menial labor, so he and Linda picked cotton. My mother's earliest childhood memory is of being pulled over uneven ground on a burlap gunny sack while her mom picked cotton. My grandma Linda stopping every couple of hours to nurse her. A thumbsucker, Jackie Jean was given one of the fluffy white balls as a pacifier. A full day's labor in the hot sun was worth a gallon of molasses that the little family ate with biscuits or stale bread, their sole diet apart from the occasional wild rabbit. The only time their bellies were full was when they sneaked back to Zella's bakery for a free meal. See, I was thinking that. I was thinking like that's probably why that girl fell for him. I would too. If you're poor, you can't afford to eat, and this place in town that got donuts, and all you gotta do is like, I don't want to say all you gotta do is like, go out on a date with this guy. I mean, I feel like that's falling in love worthy right there. And he can make you donuts. That's basically like the richest fella in town. They were saved from starvation by donated government relief: beans, canned milk, flour, and lard. Linda had to stand in line for hours to get them. It was the Great Depression, the worst financial collapse in the history of America, in which tens of thousands died of malnutrition and diseases. Jackie Jean was a sickly child who contracted rheumatic fever and strep throat that her grandmother Margaret treated with herbal remedies. When she became dangerously ill with German measles, her parents couldn't afford a doctor, so they handed her over to the Salvation Army until she was well enough to be returned. Despite almost dying, my it breaks my heart to see hungry children. It's like, I mean, anybody'd have to go hungry, but for a little child. Despite almost dying, my mother grew into a pretty child with a singing voice so powerful it could have been that of a grown woman. I guess this apple didn't fall far from that tree. People were astonished to hear her sing, and Roy would swell up with pride for the daughter he affectionately called Jack. Linda, still only a child, never took to motherhood. Well, yeah, I mean, she was just a kid. So Jackie Jean saved her love for her daddy, who was caring and fun when sober. He took her everywhere, including to the speakeasies, swinging her up on the counter to sing while he drank. The first time he passed around his hat for her in the Shamrock Saloon in St. Louis, with its spittoons and sawdust floor, he was astonished to collect 16 cents. After buying some liquor, he gave the change to his daughter, who ran to the grocery store to buy a pack of tea, a block of ice, and a bag of sugar for her teenage mother, knowing how much she longed for the sweet tea that her own mother had made her. With her final penny, Jackie Jean treated herself to some candy. The moment Roy saw that this 5-year-old child with the voice of a blues singer could turn him a profit, he declared her the breadwinner. On a good night, people would throw so many nickels that when she stuffed them into her pockets, the weight almost pulled down her pants. Although grateful for the money her daughter was earning, her mother was jealous of the attention she was getting and, tired of Roy's neglect and refusal to get married, ran away. She just disappeared and left my mom. Roy looked everywhere for Linda and listed her as a missing person. When he couldn't find her, he took Jackie Jean to stay with his sister Lodima and her husband, Wesley. Her uncle molested her. Oh my God. Her uncle molested her. This is her mom. He swore her to secrecy, so she never told her father. And when she finally confessed to her aunt Ladima, she had her mouth washed out with carbolic soap. This is so sad. It's familial trauma, and you can just see it, and you can't stop it. Helpless, she asked Jesus to save her, and maybe it worked because she caught chicken pox and was moved to the kitchen where she couldn't be abused. Jackie Jean's only escape was her singing, and she practiced every day with Roy coaching her. When they sang Danny Boy together, she felt safe. I could fly away from the trouble and the pain when I sing, she said. Having found my own escape in music my whole life, I knew exactly what she meant. After leaving St. Louis, the pair headed to Southtown in the poorest part of Oklahoma City, where Jackie Jean belted out numbers like Minnie the Moocher and the St. Louis Blues on WKY radio. One day, Jack, you're really going to be somebody, her father kept promising. Even Judy Garland don't sing as good as you do. She sang duets with band leader Bob Wills' popular hillbilly swing band whenever they came into town. It was Bob Wills who told Roy, that little girl is going to make you rich. With his hopes raised and prohibition lifted in 1933, My grandfather continued to drag her to every smoke-filled bar in town. No matter how tired or hungry she was, and barefoot on the counter because she didn't have shoes, she kept going until they collected enough for food and liquor. The stink of those bars remained with my mother forever. She always said the movie Paper Moon perfectly depicted her childhood, except that her father wasn't hawking Bibles, he was selling her voice. Roy never stopped searching for Linda, and when he finally tracked her down, he got her pregnant again and persuaded her to come back. The couple had no money for rent and lived on day-old bread soaked in watery gravy. They were only safe from eviction because the landlady took pity on Linda when she almost died from a kidney infection shortly before my Uncle Mickey was born. Poorer than he'd ever been, Grandpa needed a dream, and Jackie Jean was it. Bob Wills had told him her talents were wasted in Oklahoma, so Roy decided to take her to Hollywood, where he was convinced she'd become the new Shirley Temple, the child star who was making $1,000 per week. And this is not unusual, not then and not now, not like where parents will see their child as an asset to exploit. And I'm not even just talking about working on farms, farm or labor, go back hundreds of years. Go back thousands. How about trading and selling your kids for servitude or marriage or whatever? And then looking now, like, where what parents will do to try to get their kid to draw them some use. I see it even on beggars on the side of the road, holding up signs with the kids there. But yeah, so I can totally believe it that he saw like, hey, people will give the kid money, so let's do it. No, that's a good point, Terry. $1,000 a week is still pretty good now. So, hell yeah, I take $1,000 a week. My God, that would be great. It was in the winter of 1934 that my 8-year-old mother began hitchhiking the 1,300 miles west with her dad. Broke and hungry, they slept where they could, using Mom's voice to get into cheap hotels. No longer barefoot, she wore a beat-up pair of cowboy boots on the end of her matchstick legs. But the snow was so deep in places that it spilled over the top. A couple who gave them a ride bought my mom her first coat because they couldn't bear to see her shivering by the side of the highway, and a Greyhound bus driver ferried them across New Mexico for free before paying for their night in a motel. Yes, so he was convinced she'd become the new Shirley Temple, and Shirley Temple was making $1,000 a week, but they weren't making no 1,000 per week. They were struggling. Along the way, Roy put Mom to work selling Christmas cards on street corners and collecting empty soda bottles at movie theaters in return for free admission. Once inside, Jackie Jean stared up in wonder at the silver screen, watching movies like Little Women with Katharine Hepburn or Sons of the Desert with Laurel and Hardy, and vowed to be a star one day. Hollywood became her obsession, but when they finally made it to the slums of San Pedro in South Los Angeles, she was shocked to find that the fabled city looked nothing like it did in the movies. Even more distressing was the fact that everyone made fun of them, calling them dumb Okies because of their accents and shabby clothing. Life and genetics had already taught her that unless she was strong enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, she wouldn't make it. She might have been dirt poor, but she carried herself like a queen. Roy was a farm boy who hadn't a clue how to get his daughter's talent noticed. So, when the overnight success he'd hoped for never materialized, he took a job as a baker at a branch of Clifton's, the iconic cafeteria chain in LA. The moment his boss first set eyes on Jackie Jean, he gave her $2 to buy some proper shoes, claiming to have found the cash lying under a table. And despite looking like a homeless person with lice in her hair, Mom still won every amateur singing contest she entered and appeared regularly on the radio singing with Jimmy Wakely and his saddle pals. She was even offered a scholarship with the Meglin Kitties youth troupe, where Judy Garland had trained, but had to turn down this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity when she couldn't afford the required tap shoes. Well, that's so sad. While her father was at work, she hung out at the 5-cent movies all day, dodging creeps in the dark. At night, it was too dangerous for her to be left alone, so she slept on the bakery's dough tables. Once he'd saved up enough, he paid for Linda and baby Mickey to join them from Oklahoma. But Linda was horrified to discover that he'd fathered another child by a teenage girl. It was news to Jackie Jean, too, and she worried about her half-sibling for a long time. Faced with the prospect of losing Linda again, Roy slipped back to his old friend, bourbon. Addiction doesn't just run in my family, it gallops. That's cute. And its unhappy consequences have been repeated with dreadful symmetry throughout my life. Forced to give up his Hollywood dream, my grandfather went back east with his wife and son. He tied a name tag around Jackie Jean's neck and put her on a train to his sister Zella in Arkansas. Although she missed her father and brother terribly, Mom spent the happiest 6 months of her childhood in her aunt's comfortable home. Just the thing about the addiction, it's like, even if they made the 1,000, which they didn't make the 1,000, but the thing that money, it's like, what I've noticed in people is like often with celebrities, but they don't have to be like super celebrities. They could just be semi-famous. How do I say this? Hold on. The sip of my cinnamon coffee. I wish Pale was here. I know he's been working so much, but so I feel like it's just a bother to him to have to check in. But I just want to say I really appreciate my moderators, because you guys know I always been afraid to come back to this channel because mean people come out of the woodwork, like the other day where that person said, that ace person. And so I always feel the comfort and safety that, because you don't have to moderate, but you do it for me, and I appreciate it. Anyway, maybe after the holidays, it'll be, he'll come back. Oh, thank you, Arthur. Anyway, I can't wait to talk to you tomorrow too, you guys. I missed being able to talk to you. Anyway, okay, so the addiction thing. Say someone makes a lot of money, like, I feel so bad to signal this woman out, but she's just been popping up everywhere. That I don't know how to say it, like, because that's what her claim to fame is, being the how can I say, welcoming 101 men into the fold. Anyway, and some people say, like, oh, she has this much money, millions of dollars, right? And I thought to myself, I would fear for her. I would fear for depression. I would fear for because at that level of money, you can afford a lot of drugs. Can you say, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to, because I'm reading a book with heavy subject matter. So I don't want to get banned, but it's, this is real life stuff, so, you can afford behaviors that, I mean, you shouldn't anyway if you're rich or poor, but you could afford behaviors to self-medicate. And then from there, what I've noticed is it's a slippery slope of you become accustomed to something. Like even when we read Demon Copperhead, how it started with the pain from the football accident, and it builds into this like need. And it really, when you have an addiction, it really is like that because your body tells you it needs this, right? But it started as a need for the pain. But whatever it is in your life that you feel you need to get by. So that's why it's often with performers. Because when you think about like rock stars on the road, think about like those rock bands from the 80s and whatever, and they'll use things to get through, and they'll tell themselves, there's people that rely on me to do these shows, people that are employed or fans. And so if I got to take something to get through it, that's a need, right? So as that rises and rises and rises, whatever, even if the guy could make the money, if he's doing this bourbon or this, it rises to, well, I need this now to get by my pain and my depression, or I need this to get, and you might not even notice it as that's now building. Because you might tell yourself, like, if you tell yourself right now, today, wherever you are in life, like, say whatever your heat is set at, right? You might tell yourself, this is what it needs to be because this is where I'm comfortable. And I don't know if it wasn't this, like if it was lower. This is from, obviously, like if you're in Australia, maybe it's hot, but for where I am, it's, well, I live in the desert and it was in the 80s today, but in America, it's colder, okay? What I'm saying is, you say you like it at 75. You could survive at 60, but you'll tell yourself, I have to make whatever to afford this because I don't know if I can, because this is, I feel like I'm just barely getting through the day and it's at 75. So I must need this. Anyway, this is just to say that I worry for people that suffer when they get to a certain point of success, because it's a very, very dangerous time for them to wind up in very dangerous addictions that they otherwise, without the money, wouldn't have. I guess with some of these drinkers, they're poor. Like there always seems to be a way. They're homeless people that drink out of a paper bag. They'll find a way, I guess. But 65 is better. Well, yes. Well, you run hot though, don't you? Yeah, well, money won't help her, but I worry about her taking something to numb whatever that is, Anyway. Zella, who I loved, was a force of nature who loved Jackie Jean like a daughter. The kid who'd owned nothing was cleaned up, was put in pretty dresses, and had ribbons threaded in her hair. She won a statewide amateur talent contest in her category for singing the blues. Zella wanted to adopt her and one day send her to college. But when Jackie Jean found out that Linda had walked out on Roy for good, leaving Mickey behind, good for her! She was so afraid for her little brother that she went back to keep him safe. She found them living in the slums of Oklahoma City. Roy was still so desperate to get Linda back that when he found out where she was working, he bullied her into visiting her kids. Too afraid to tell him that she'd married a Sicilian man, she agreed. Shocked by how her children were living, she returned a few days later with some money and clothes. But Roy forced her into bed After the Sicilian found out what happened, he knocked several of Grandpa's teeth out and told his wife that he'd adopt her children. Soon afterward, my grandfather received a court order informing him that he had lost custody. News that finally tipped him over the edge. Well, lost your custody and your teeth. That's a bad week. My mother's recollection of what must have been the worst night of her life was always patchy. It was only when I paid for her to go into therapy years later that the details were finally unlocked. Staying in that crummy place full of crawling things that bit them, Jackie Jean forced herself to lay awake for fear that men might break in and molest them. As she stared out the window, she told herself, "When I grow up, I will not live this way." She must have dozed off because later she woke to the sound of hissing. Not quite awake, she imagined for a moment that the room was full of snakes, but then saw a shadowy figure cross their room. Highly attuned to danger, she pretended to be asleep until he leapt. Choking, she suddenly realized that it wasn't snakes she could hear, but gas. Jumping up, she grabbed Mickey and ran with him to a neighbor who called the police. It was only later that my mom realized the shadowy figure she'd seen at 3 a.m. was her father. She recognized his gait and distinctive smell of fresh yeast. Roy had come back from his shift, turned on the gas, and left. Holy shit, what? She'd heard his steps disappearing down the stairs. The scariest part for her was that Roy was stone cold sober, and for a long time she couldn't admit to herself that the only parent who ever seemed to love her and my Uncle Mickey had tried to end their lives. The children moved with their mother and Sicilian stepfather to a district of Los Angeles named Gardena, with identical houses and tiny lawns. That stretch of town went on for miles. Roy stayed in Oklahoma and had no contact with the children he'd attempted to murder, even though his daughter still missed him. That year was only made better for Jackie Jean by her stepfather, who gave her the affectionate nickname String Bean. He was the only kind man she'd ever known. Once again, though, Linda grew jealous of their closeness, and when my mom reached 13, the same age her mother had been when she'd given birth to her, she told her she'd have to go back to live with Roy. She was leaving the Sicilian for his nephew and taking Mickey with her. I mean, geez, my family, you couldn't make it up. She couldn't face the chaos of life with her father, so Jackie Jean scanned the want ads and found work as a live-in maid in Hannock Park. Her employer's home was huge and her chores tough, but my mother never complained because it was the best place she'd ever lived. Vermin-free, it had clean sheets, and there was a hot meal on the table every evening. As long as all her work was done, she was allowed to attend a local high school during the day and study late at night. Mom became well-read, got good grades, and worked on improving her Okie accent by reading aloud to herself. Afraid that the rich girls at school might discover how she lived, she got them to like her by showing off her vocal chops. She also played on her image as a nerdy bookworm, too busy editing the school yearbook to socialize or spend money she didn't have. With the encouragement of her teachers, she finally became the somebody her daddy always wanted her to be. Although it broke her heart that nobody in her immediate family cared, every night she curled up on the bathroom floor sobbing into a towel. Ugh, I'm sorry, but that's like... Oh, this is getting really choked up. Because this reminds me of when I was 18 and I was thrown out and I had nowhere to live. And So I had to work as a maid for these people, and that was when I got assaulted. And I would cry every night too, because I knew nobody loved me and cared what was happening to me. So like that feeling of like, not just hopelessness, but like really like missing the feeling that like nobody cares about you. Yeah, it's so weird because I love Cher so much, but like it might seem like you're not even reading about her yet, but so much of how you are is from how like the people that raised you, how they were raised in their lives. And so much of her is probably a result of her mom and what happened with her mom, you know? But her mom's story is just so, it just feels so real to me, so heartbreaking. Every night she curled up on the bathroom floor, sobbing into a towel so that no one could hear her. And there were times when she even considered killing herself. Something stopped her, a determination to survive, passed on through the female line. Studying hard for a scholarship to college, Jackie Jean was devastated when Roy wrote and begged her to come home. He'd fallen off a curb in Oklahoma City and broken several ribs, putting him in a full body cast. Wow. At 15, she gave up her dreams of higher education, and out of a strange mix of pity, love, and duty, she went back to care for her father. But she was determined to return to the city she thought of as home. She told me, I knew I had to try to climb up and get back to Los Angeles. Little did she know where that decision would lead both of us. Chapter 2. I'm so lonesome I could cry. 45 degrees? Well, the rental car I'm in now, while mine is in the shop, said 84 when I got into it. But it drops a lot at night, so it's cooler now, I'm sure. By the age of 18, Jackie Jean was an accident waiting to happen. She looked like a movie star. I'm going to show you a picture of her mom. Her mom, when she says her mom was gorgeous, her mom was gorgeous. Like, she literally did look like a movie star. You'll see. Built like a goddess with an incredible body, a mane of chestnut hair. I think she was blonde, the pictures I saw, and always dressed with perfect taste. You'd never know her clothes all came from the thrift store, but on the inside, she was still a country girl at heart and far too easy to manipulate. She had been raised a Baptist, and it had been drilled into her by Roy that she should never have sex with a man until she was married. Roy is one to talk. Don't you ever let a man touch you unless you're wed. But don't all fathers say that? Not until you're 45. Her father warned her repeatedly, no doubt reflecting on his own history. Oh my God, I was just thinking. You know what? If you I was just thinking, like, if you're a girl and a guy asks you on a date, say, like, just to go to the Denny's, go to the McDonald's, go get like a cheeseburger and a shake, and your dad is like, where have you been, you whore? You go, you have shamed our family. Then hold up a picture, be like, have you heard about this woman
and 101 in one day. Don't talk. Literally a shamrock shake, okay? That's the only thing I was guzzling. Meanwhile, in England, okay? With his words ringing in her ears, Jackie Jean got it into her head that she'd get pregnant if she even French kissed a boy. And after her childhood molestation, she was determined to avoid sex until she met Mr. Right. My smooth talking Armenian father, Johnny Sarkisian, was Mr. Wrong from the outset. And when she asked my mother to jitterbug with him at a Harry James big band dance in Fresno, California in 1944, her instincts warned her to be careful. The spoiled youngest son of a large Armenian family, Johnny was a year older than Mom, but wore the kind of flashy clothes and jewelry that gave him an air of greater maturity. He wasn't her type and was too short for her taste, but when they danced together, her blouse got caught on his shirt button and she literally couldn't get away. By the time he'd unhooked her, she realized that he not only was a good dancer, but possessed a certain charm. They started dating at a time when life had a heightened reality and a sense of spontaneity because of the war raging across Europe. Even though Johnny had been drafted into the U.S. Coast Guard before he was medically discharged, neither he nor my mother had any firsthand experiences of World War II. When Mom's friend Anne started dating Johnny's best friend, Johnny Kevorkian, yeah, but this Johnny is spelled different with a Y, not an I-E. I feel like if your name is Johnny, you have an obligation not to have a best friend named Johnny. Like, could you imagine me having a best friend named Stella? How do you even go about that? Johnny saved her. His first grandstand play. His next was to teach her to drive and promised her his Buick convertible. After that, the couple started seeing each other regularly, but she wouldn't sleep with him because they weren't married. One night in the club where Jackie Jean worked as a waitress and a singer, a customer who knew Johnny's weakness for gambling threw some money on the table and told him, "Stop mooning around her like a sick cow. Marry her." He challenged him to drive her to Reno, Nevada, where couples could marry with no waiting period. Cheered on by friends with a similar idea, four of them left that night, beguiled by his charm and apparent stability, and impressed by his age and experience. Mom found him strong, quiet, and capable. Before she knew it, she was pronounced Miss Sarkisian. In a hasty double wedding, having just turned 19 and having not yet found her sass, it didn't occur to my mother to say no, even though she thought, "What am I doing?" and was so unhappy it was all she could do not to cry. Less than 24 hours after the ceremony, and still a virgin, she walked out on Johnny and fled back to Fresno, where a friend promised to help her apply for an annulment. My father followed and wouldn't hear of it. "How do you know you don't want to be married?" he protested. "You haven't even tried it yet. Give me 3 months." Gullible and trapped, my mother was living at a time when women had little or no support from society. So, seeing no other way out, she went back to Johnny, even though she claimed she never loved or trusted him. He could always outtalk me, outthink me, and outsmart me. I was no match for him, and he charmed me into it, and by it, I knew she meant sex. Well, you had to get born somehow, Cher. The women in my family rarely chose their men well, and Jackie Jean was no exception. But with Linda, her sole role model, she stood little chance. Beneath his polished veneer, my father would become a heroin addict with a penchant for larceny and a shaky relationship to employment. Not that she knew that to begin with. As newlyweds, my parents led a chaotic, nomadic existence, living on my mother's wages and staying with Armenian relatives until their patience or funds ran out. Johnny's family was disappointed because no one had ever married a non Armenian woman, but seeing as my dad was the spoiled child, they forgave him. Except for my grandmother, who was very upset and said, Ho Vance, she's too long for you. The only relative who really welcomed my mom was Aunt Roxy, who wasn't at all traditional like the rest of them. She wanted to be an American girl and do everything my mom did. They got on like a house on fire, but it wasn't enough to keep her with my dad. So miserable, she walked out after the 3 months were up and sought solace with her 32-year-old mother. Instead of taking pity on her, however, Grandma Linda demanded to know if she was pregnant. When it turned out that she was, Linda, a waitress who had no intention of being saddled with a brat, took her to get an abortion. With nowhere else to go, my mother reluctantly agreed and was taken to a sympathetic doctor in Long Beach, one of a handful of professionals who helped women illegally, despite the risks of imprisonment, not unlike today. Mom was petrified. She told me years later, I remember waiting in an old fashioned chrome chair. The chrome was cold, yet the sweat was running off me. I was so scared. When they told me it was my turn, I got onto the table, but as I lay there, I somehow knew I couldn't go through with it. So I got off. Can you believe I came that close to not having you? She was at a dreadful point in her young life, with only two roads to choose from, neither of which were easy. Confused and afraid, she headed down one road, but then turned back and took the other. I survived as a consequence, and I've never questioned how close she came to not having me. It was her body, her life, and her choice to make. Thank God she got off that table, though, or I wouldn't be here to write these pages. Linda was furious at Jackie Jean's change of heart and warned her, if you don't go through with this, don't think you can come home to me. Distraught, Mom fled from the clinic where my heartbeat was almost stilled. Returning to Johnny, she was so angry with her mother that they didn't speak for months. Once her pregnancy started to show and it was considered no longer decent for her to sing in public, Jackie Jean had to give up work. With no money coming in, my father moved them to the sleepy town of El Centro near the Mexican border, where he planned to run a trucking company that he'd persuaded his father to buy. Its drivers hauled fresh produce to the markets of Los Angeles, and for a time life was good. Johnny found them a house and acted more responsibly at first, but then he started playing poker every night and often didn't return home. Unhappy, stressed, and feeling trapped, my mother went into labor a month early and was taken to the only hospital in El Centro. With a small maternity unit, there was no pain relief, and the labor was long. She was exhausted by the time I arrived at around 7:30 a.m. on Monday, May 20th, 1946. I was born under the sign of Taurus. Like me. I didn't know that. On the cusp of Gemini. So it's like there are three of us in here. Premature. I wanted to get the hell out of there, find me some wheels and get going. But weighing only 6 pounds, I had to stick around the hospital a few weeks longer. Grandma Linda hadn't spoken to Mom since she fled from the abortion clinic, but the night before I was born, she had a psychic dream and woke up my Grandpa Charlie in the middle of the night. Get up, we have to go, she told him. Jackie Jean's having a baby girl. In a rare pang of maternal guilt, she made him drive all night to El Centro so that she could greet me. While my mother was recovering in the hospital, a nurse came into her room and asked, "And what are you going to name your baby?" My mother had no idea, but the woman insisted, so she replied, "Well, Lana Turner's my favorite actress, and her little girl's called Cheryl. My mother's name is Linda, so how about Sherry Lynn?" I believed Sherry Lynn was my name until the day years later when I decided to legally change my name to simply Cher. When I applied for my birth certificate, I was shocked to find that I was officially registered as Cheryl and asked my mother, "Do you even know my real name, Mom?" "Let me look at that," she cried, snatching the document. Presented with the evidence, she shrugged. "I was only a teenager, and I was in a lot of pain. Give me a break." Oh my gosh, she didn't even know her daughter's name? What? What? Sherilyn. To celebrate my birth, Johnny bought Mom a ruby and diamond watch in pink gold and furnished her with a cradle and buggy. Happy in her maternal cocoon, she became the little woman in the kitchen for the first time in her life and even embroidered the tiny kimono the hospital sent me home in. I still have it because my mom had it framed for me as a birthday gift. Their home was modest, but they had enough, and she was happy. Then, 6 months after my birth, Johnny came home one night and told her that he'd lost his father's trucking business in a card game. Everything was gone. My mother couldn't believe what she was hearing. Ugh. Then again, he married you on a bet, too, though. Within days, she had to vacate their home, hawk her watch, and move into an ugly steel Quonset hut, an arched, prefabricated building often used as barracks during the war. In temperatures of up to 120 degrees in the desert, it was like living inside an oven. When she threatened to leave again, Johnny came up with some money and a plan. They'd go to New York, where he had a sister who he hoped would invest in his next venture. It sounded implausible, but Mom was so desperate to get out of that metal coffin that she had no choice but to pack her bags. During an interminable 50-hour ride on a Greyhound bus, they traveled 2,500 miles across 9 states. Making multiple changes on the way, Johnny confessed that he had stolen a car and sold it in Mexico to pay the fare, but almost got caught. And there was a warrant out for his arrest. Perhaps picking up on my mother's distress, I cried constantly, and she didn't know how to calm me. I didn't do well as a mother, she admitted. I was hysterical all the time because of the turmoil I was in. But what example did she have? And her own mother, poor thing, was only 13 when she had her child. So, I mean, none of these women, seem to have much guidance to go on. Actually, didn't Cher meet Sonny when she was like 16? I'm not sure, but I think so. Let's see. Johnny's sister Liz lived in a tiny New York apartment and had neither the funds to invest in any business nor the space to although Cher didn't get pregnant at that point. Actually, Cher was pregnant during their divorce. Yeah. For chastity. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe even, yeah. I think they were already separated. But I'm sure we'll get to that. New York apartment and had neither the funds to invest in any business nor the space to share her home. Walking the freezing streets wrapped in Johnny's overcoat, Mom pressed me against her body to keep me warm. Her husband became increasingly paranoid every time he saw a cop and claimed it was too risky for him to apply for a job. With their money running out, Jackie Jean knew she needed to do something. She applied for a position as a hat check girl at the Copacabana nightclub on East 60th Street, where the boss, a mobster, demanded to see her legs. After she nervously lifted her dress, he was so impressed that he upgraded her to cigarette girl. Demand to see her legs. Could I work at the Copacabana? I think the Copacabana was in I Love Lucy. His customers at the Brazilian-themed club and restaurant could admire them too. The club that would become famous in the 50s and 60s for hosting shows by Dean Martin, Jerry Lewis, and Sammy Davis Jr., and would later be immortalized in Barry Manilow's song of the same name, was bustling, and Mom made good money. She was even able to pocket a few illicit tips, but after she received her first paycheck, Johnny announced that they were leaving the city as the New York police were onto him. Reassuring my mother that he'd get work in Scranton, Pennsylvania, 100 miles northwest of New York, he promised to get us back to California. After another long bus journey, he checked us into a cheap hotel, but the jobs he bragged about never materialized. This was my mother's worst nightmare. When they were down to a few cents, enough to buy me 2 bottles of milk, she lost it completely. "You must do something, Johnny," she shrieked. "We have a child depending on us now." Years later, she was like a tigress when it came to protecting me and my sister. But back then, she was unaware of how strong she was. My father said he'd hitchhike back to New York to borrow money from his sister, while my mother found work as a waitress. "But what about the baby?" she asked, horrified. Raised a Catholic, my father had an answer for that too. "There's got to be a church organization around here that we can board her with until we've got enough money to get her back." Gifted in the art of persuasion, he then sold his sob story to a priest, who put him in touch with the nuns at a local home for children and unwed mothers. "It'll only be for 2 weeks," he promised Jackie Jean. "Then I'll be back for you and little Sherilyn, and we'll all go home." At first, Mom was calm. In her mind, there was a plan in place. Everything would be fine. Her husband and child would be back in 2 weeks. But once my dad left, the reality of the situation came crashing down on her. Mom didn't know a soul in the sprawling coal mining town. She hardly had a cent to her name, and her baby was in a strange institution. When Johnny took off, Mom moved into an 8 by 10 room that was little more than a cubicle and found a job in an all-night diner where she was expected to work 12-hour shifts from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 7 days a week. As a mother, I can only imagine, and the thought chills my bones. The home where she left me was one of hundreds dotted all over the United States that took in poverty-stricken orphans and other kids until their families could afford to care for them. Jackie Jean was appalled by the idea of leaving me with these severe-looking sisters in black robes, even if it was only temporary. Her concerns were only magnified when she sensed the nuns' disapproval of her from the outset for being a Baptist. Powerless, she walked away in tears as my howls rang in her ears. Returning to her cramped accommodation every dawn after her shift, she'd crawl into bed and cry herself to sleep. Alone in the world with no friends, no baby, and her husband gone, she didn't know how much longer she could go on and scanned the newspaper looking for a better paying job. A lucky break came with a position in the Manila Bar and Grill, where she was hired as a waitress and singer. The owner was kind, the tips were good, and she was able to visit me twice a week. Everything began to feel more hopeful until, to her horror, Jackie Jean discovered that she was pregnant by my father, the only man she'd ever had sex with. Again, her life was spinning out of control. Aside from singing, the one thing Mom had learned was how to use her looks to get out of a bind. There was a regular at her restaurant, an older married man named Dave. He tipped generously, especially if she sang his favorite song, My Man. My mother begged for his help. But where's your husband, kid? He asked. And when she broke down, he agreed reluctantly, telling her, You're asking an awful lot from a guy who's never even kissed you. He nevertheless found a woman who would perform an abortion for $100 and arranged for someone to drive my mother to and from the secret address. After the procedure, Jackie Jean was in so much pain that she had to be driven straight to the home of a nurse instead. She was in bed for 3 weeks to recover. When Dave visited Mom in her sick bed, she asked him what he'd have done if she hadn't survived. His reply shocked her. Kid, I won't lie to you. We'd have dumped your body in the river, or we could have all gone to jail. If that had happened, I'd have been adopted or remained with the nuns forever. Shocking as Dave's answer now sounds, prosecutions of those who carried out abortions were commonplace. Police kicking down the doors of clinics and private homes was as everyday as their raids on brothels and gambling dens. Those who were caught helping women faced prison sentences, once again not unlike now, of an average of 3 to 5 years, and lost their license to practice if they had medical qualifications. The women were generally regarded as victims and coerced into testifying, but the stigma of the trial could ruin them. So the risks were enormous for everyone. Dump your body in the river? Damn. As soon as she was healthy again, after those 3 weeks, Mom hurried to the children's home to pay for my keep and collect me for a day out. She was shocked when the nuns forbade it. She wasn't even allowed to hold me. All they'd let her do was view me through a small window and a door. As I looked in, you were standing in your crib, holding onto the sides and crying. I was crying too. I felt so helpless. Her protests fell on deaf ears, and the Mother Superior was especially unkind to her because she worked in a place that sold liquor. She didn't even believe Mom was married and kept asking, Why isn't your husband here? Isn't he concerned for his child? Unsophisticated in the ways of the world, Jackie Jean was afraid that if she stood up for herself, the home might keep me forever. With no way to contact Johnny and no one else to turn to, she decided that the minute my dad came back from New York, she'd insist he get me out. My deadbeat father never returned or even sent word. He simply vanished. In time, she convinced herself that the only reason she was destined to meet him in the first place was so that I would exist. That was all he was good for. I cried so many nights in my tiny room wondering what I was going to do and where in the hell was Johnny. I really hated him. All she could do was go to the children's home each week and demand to see me. The sight of my little face through the viewing window broke her heart, but it was on one of those visits that she borrowed a camera to take the photograph she held so dear. By early 1947, the Mother Superior declared that Jackie Jean Sarkisian was an unfit mother, and it would be better if she gave me up for adoption. Mom refused, but it was almost impossible to question authority as a penniless single mother. She went to Dave again, remembering that he was a city council member. Reluctantly, he agreed to help, saying, I can't buck the entire Catholic Church, but I'll figure something out. After he took her to dinner on her next day off, she was fearful of where this might lead, but she would have made a pact with the devil to save me. Dave offered to buy her train ticket. He then marched into the children's home and told the Mother Superior, "You have no legal right to keep Sherilyn Sarkisian here anymore." Frightened, she handed me straight over. To her dying day, my mother couldn't or wouldn't remember how long I was in that place, but it must have been several months, as I arrived as an infant barely able to crawl, and when I came out, I was walking. The behavior of those nuns haunted my mother her whole life. Mine is one of hundreds of similar stories of children kept by the church or put up for adoption against the will of their frightened young mothers, who were condemned as being sinful or irresponsible. That kind of shit has been happening to women since the beginning of time. I have since come to know many wonderful and loving nuns in my life, but I still find it hard to forgive those who tried to take my mother's child and ruin both our lives. Almost 50 years later, I finally expressed my feelings about that time in a song I wrote for my mom called Sisters of Mercy. It was one of the few that I ever wrote, sang, and produced myself. I woke up one day in 1994 in a chateau in France where I'd been invited to a songwriting symposium, and the words poured out of me in one sitting. They begin, your faith is not faithful. Your grace has no grace. Your mercy shows no mercy. Is there no way out of this place? I didn't hold back because it continues. There's a baby sobbing softly in a crib that's now a cage. She's done nothing to deserve this, but it sanctifies their rage. The chorus was, Sisters of Mercy, Daughters of Hell. When I first played it to Mom, she sobbed and sobbed, but I think it made her feel vindicated and took some of the pain away. Furious, some elements of the Catholic Church damned my song as extremely inflammatory. I understood their response. It was a tough song, but I did it for my mom, and it brought her some kind of relief. Sisters of Mercy wasn't a condemnation of the entire Catholic Church, but a valid and heartfelt response to those who used their power to hurt my mom. In all that time, she was never able to share the only photograph of me in that forbidding institution, an image left lying in the back of a drawer. She couldn't get through 5 words about it without breaking down. And yet, of all the millions of pictures taken of me over the years, that was the one I most desperately wanted to see but never did. Chapter 3. A dream is a wish your heart makes. One thing is for certain. My childhood was never normal, but it was only once I was older that I fully understood why I've always hated being left. Maybe that's why I always left first. Given my history, it's probably not surprising. My fear of abandonment undoubtedly stems from being separated from my mother as a baby, and my inner drama queen has become an integral part of the complicated human being that is me. After Mom freed me from the nuns, she caught a train to Twin Falls, Idaho, where my grandpa Roy and Uncle Mickey were living in squalor. Rescuing her 12-year-old brother, she made her way to LA, where she settled him with Grandma Linda temporarily while she eked out a living waiting tables. I was a little over a year old, so I have no memories from this time, but I had been told that I'd been babysat by my grandma's friends Edith and Mackie while Mom worked her ass off. It wasn't until I was in my 30s and playing at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas that Grandma Linda came backstage right before my show as I was putting on my makeup and introduced me to Mackie, who'd been her neighbor. I heard a lot about her and knew she was one of my babysitters when I was little, but then she produced an old wooden high chair with a worn decal of Bambi. "This was yours when you used to live with us," Mackie announced, eager for me to have it. "Live with you?" I asked, so taken aback that I could barely speak. In my mind, I thought, fuck, the blows just keep on coming. You know how sometimes if you start to talk, you'll end up crying? So instead, I just sat in stunned silence and continued to put my makeup on. I knew I had a sold out performance, and by that time in my life, I was able to compartmentalize, which is a trick that served me well through the rest of my career. This has happened to me more times than I care to remember. Something upsetting right before I have to perform. It's strange. You kind of go into a suspended animation. It wasn't until much later that I was able to corner my grandmother, who told me that my stay in the children's home wasn't the only time I'd been left in the care of virtual strangers. When I was around 2 years old, Mackie took me in, as did Edith, who was a young mother at the time. I thought, damn, this is abandonment never ending. So, how long was I with these women? I asked, reeling. Oh, for quite a long time, Linda replied, having never had a normal childhood herself. This fact didn't faze her at all, and she revealed it to me casually, as if it were important that I'd been dumped again because my own family couldn't care for me. No wonder I felt so insecure and had separation anxiety throughout my life. The emotions that bubbled to the surface with this new information troubled me for a long time. I began to remember strange things, jigsaw pieces of the past that made me feel as if I had no connection to parts of my own story. I didn't know how to put the pieces together and needed someone to help me. But I don't understand, I told my grandmother. Where was Mom all this time? Linda hesitated. Well, she was young and busy, and then she met this guy in Reno, and he was rich. I stopped her dead. I knew in that instant that Linda, who was obsessed with finding my mom a wealthy husband, would have encouraged her to stay with a wealthy man, even if that meant giving me up. So, although Mom had fought for me in Scranton, pressured by my grandmother, she'd left me again. What the fuck? The story of what happened after that unfolded gradually, and the timeline still isn't clear. After I'd been saved from the nuns, I was left with Mackie and Edith, and Mickey was placed with somewhere else. Meanwhile, my mother and grandmother traveled to Nevada to seek divorces from their respective husbands, taking advantage of what was dubbed the Reno Cure. They had to establish residency for 6 weeks before their separations could become legal. While in Reno, there was a local beauty pageant Linda urged Mom to enter, even though neither thought she would actually win. Mom was amazed when she was crowned the Model Miss. She won a cash prize, and her picture was in the paper for days. In one photograph, she was winking at someone in the audience, and when I asked who that was, she said it was my grandmother. My grandmother was even more excited when she spotted Ernest Prim, a millionaire who was a regular in the Gardena Club in LA, where Linda was his favorite waitress. Ernie was a middle-aged, balding Texan with a property empire that included Reno's Palace Club Casino and the Prima Donna Club. It was a match made in heaven, my grandmother's greed and his money. Linda was eager to introduce her single daughter to the man she called the big boss. Grandma Linda soon set her sights on making Ernest Prim her son-in-law. As she was fond of saying, it's as easy to fall in love with a rich man as it is a poor man. If you hear that often enough when you're young, you start to believe it, especially when your own mother sets you up. To this day, I feel sorry for my grandmother and the life she had. And I'm even more sorry that she instilled so much toxic stuff in my mom, who was so needy of her love and approval. She would tell me the same about marrying a rich man when I was growing up. And it's where she got her belief that if you were beautiful, you deserved a man who's loaded. Linda's scheming went better than she'd hoped because Ernie fell for Mom after watching her sing "Can't Help Fall, Can't Help Lovin' That Man" in a supper club. From then on, he was all over her like a cheap suit, buying her a mink coat and a diamond bracelet. This was a huge shift from her experience with my father, Johnny, and she was dazzled. Ernie was also far better educated, and he drilled the heck out of her by teaching her how to dress, eat, walk, and even play craps. Using her natural poise and her fond memories of her statuesque Aunt Zella, she threw her shoulders back and became such an elegant lady that few would have guessed she came from Skid Row, though she'd still talk like a sailor among friends, which is where I get it from. Still, in her early 20s, Mom became fond of Ernie and knew they could have a wonderful life together once his own divorce was finalized. There was only one problem: he didn't want me around. Promising that I'd be educated in the finest schools on his dime, Ernie made it clear that I wasn't part of the deal. Mom chose to heed Linda's advice to be patient. He'll give you the moon with a string on it when you become his wife. Once their divorces became official, the two women returned to LA. My mom entered and won another contest. This round was for Miss Holiday on Wings. She was photographed in a swimsuit sitting astride a model plane. The cash prize was a staggering $750, much more than she'd have earned as a waitress in a month. This time, she was spotted by a talent scout who offered her a scholarship to the Ben Bard School of Dramatic Arts, one of the most respected drama schools in Hollywood. This was all she'd hoped for when she swore on Skid Row that she'd have a better life. This would count as the first step in keeping the promise she had made to herself all those years ago, sitting up through the night watching over her little brother. But still waiting for Ernie, she postponed her enrollment, and I remained with Mackie and Edith. One night, she attended a gala event at the Hollywood Palladium. Mom was asked to dance by a devastatingly handsome young actor named Chris Alcade. He towered over her at 6 feet 4 inches. Chris worked at Dolores Drive-In on Wilshire Boulevard, but was studying drama at Ben Bard's, which felt to my mom like fate. After a few more meetings, they started dating behind Ernie's back. The first time I met Chris, my mother watched as he folded at the waist. He threw open his arms, and I ran into them. Ernie would never have done anything like that. I'm going to marry that man, Mom thought, knowing then that she could never be with a man who didn't love me. She walked away from Ernie and all he had to offer, telling him she wouldn't give me up. She and Chris were married a few days later. A few days! Making him husband number 2. She then enrolled in the drama school where, coincidentally, Shirley Temple had first learned her craft. It was the closest Jackie Jean got to being like Little Miss Miracle, as her father once dreamed. Ben Bard, the founder of the drama school, was a former vaudeville and silent movie star who was a talent scout for 20th Century Fox. My mother was in class with some heavy hitters to be, including Rod Steiger, who went on to star in On the Waterfront and In the Heat of the Night, Stuart Whitman, David Jansen, and Robert Bob Mitchum. With all these colorful characters around me, it's no surprise that I ended up as a performer. Life felt settled for Mom, Chris, and me. She had her classes at night, which she loved, and was booking commercials for Hot Point washing machines, cars, watches, and even beech nut peppermint gum on programs like the Dinah Shore Show. My babysitters would drop me at her drama class in the evenings, and I'd watch rehearsals of productions like Oklahoma and A Christmas Carol. Being the only kid there, I was made a big fuss of, and when I could no longer keep my eyes open, I'd curl up under my mother's coat at the back of the theater and fall asleep. I memorized my first Shakespearean monologue at Ben Bard at 4. I didn't have a clue about ancient prose or iambic pentameter. I just liked the rhythm of the words and the sound they made. Nor did I understand the play Mom was rehearsing, but I thought the spooky chicks were cool. I surprised everyone by coming out with the Song of the Witches from Macbeth, which begins double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Nobody could believe that I could pick up something so complicated and repeat it. The skill was unique for a 4-year-old and has served me well my whole life. Whenever the drama school put out a musical, my mom was given the lead because she was by far the best singer. Oh, good night, John. I was accustomed to her singing at home, but it felt different watching her belt out the big numbers on a stage, and I loved it. My mom and all the cast were so good at their performances that at 4, it felt real to me when she played Lori in Oklahoma, and Michael and Sarah as the villain Judd attacked her. The moment Mom started screaming for help, I became so hysterical that I had to be taken outside. I only calmed down when Michael gently explained that it wasn't real. He was so sweet with me. He was devilishly handsome with dark features, and I felt a special affinity with the Syrian born actor with the same look as me. He went on to play Cochise on the TV show Broken Arrow. It was Michael who inadvertently caused Mom to leave her husband after months of fighting. Chris Alcade was a jealous type who couldn't bear another man paying her any attention. This was especially true when he had too much to drink, which was often. At one cocktail party, he spotted a tipsy Michael and Sarah make a pass at her while she was getting their coats from the bedroom. Chris grabbed her and shook her until she thought her head would snap off. When they got home, their fight turned more violent. He pushed her up against the wall and closed his fingers around her throat. Her survival instincts kicked in and she cried, "What will happen to Cher if you kill me and go to jail?" In his drunken, angry state, it was only his fondness for me that made him stop. They divorced soon afterward, and at Linda's suggestion, Mom tried to win back Ernie Prim, but once he made it clear I'd never live with them, she walked away from him for good. I don't remember Ernie at all and only have a faint memory of Chris. I do know that he was very handsome, but then all of my mom's friends looked like movie stars to me. They were all so talented and working across the arts: singers, dancers, painters, sculptors. I didn't know where people who work. I didn't know there were people who worked in offices. I knew there were cab drivers. From the age of 4, this was my world. Those were my role models. Not long after she broke up with Chris, she met the first true love of her life, a struggling actor named E.J. John Southall. She fell for him the minute she set eyes on him, something she had never felt before. My mom married John, husband number 3, but this time for love. He was and is the only man I think of as my father. Having declared that men are things you love against your will, my mother was becoming a serial monogamist. The new man in her life was charming, handsome, and penniless. I suspect that one of the reasons the sun-tanned, sweet-talking Texan who'd captained B-29 bombers during the Korean War never made it as an actor was because he couldn't lose his accent. It was so profound that people would start singing the Yellow Rose of Texas, but it was enough to keep him typecast. If looking good were a marketable skill, though, he'd have been a millionaire. They made a spectacular couple. My mom's best friend was Jackie, known to all as Jake. Her husband was Kenny. John and Kenny were in the same drama class. The four of them became very close. An only child, John had no memories of his own dad, Eunice James Harmon Southall, known as EJ, who was gassed in the First World War and died in 1934 at the age of 41. My new stepfather was christened after him, but everyone outside his family called him John. Raised in Texas by his grandmother and two loving aunts, he was eager for a family of his own. Not long after he and Mom were wed, he told her to fetch me from my babysitters and bring me to live with them, which is how, at the age of 4.5, I found myself with a dad for the first time. In the back of my head, I knew that he wasn't my real father, but I never gave it any thought. I also knew that there was another someone out there. A shadowy figure I sensed was a man that nobody talked about, a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Most important, the only man I ever called daddy loved me and treated me as his own. That was good enough for me. Like most budding actors, my stepfather was constantly on the grind and earned a living doing something else. In his case, selling aluminum siding door to door with Kenny. They were both so handsome, I'm amazed they weren't siding tycoons. Aside from Bob Mitchum and Rod Steiger, all my parents' actor friends had side hustles to pay the rent, doing anything from bartending to interior decorating. They didn't know how to have a 9 to 5, and none of them wanted that anyway. Lacking a formal education, my mom honed her acting skills and took any acting job she got. She even tried her hand at stunt driving and drove in a few commercials. She played a dance hall girl in the TV Western Gunsmoke and had a walk-on part in shows like The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet and I Love Lucy. In one hilarious episode with Lucille Ball that has been shown repeatedly over the years, my mom and two other actors played Paris models wearing gowns made of potato sacks and surrealist flower pot hats. The woman mom knew as Lucy liked her because she was young and pretty with dark red hair, so she hired her regularly. My mom admired and respected Lucy, so it made it even more difficult when she had to dodge advances from Desi Arnaz, Lucy's husband. She had a similar problem with Ozzie, of Ozzie and Harriet, who once tried to show an actor several times over how to kiss mom properly in a scene. Ew, the heck? Ozzie and Harriet, wasn't Harriet the mom that was like the homemaker? Or am I thinking of June Cleaver? That everyone is like, my mom would be like, I'm not like that. That, Ricky Nelson's mom, yeah. If she couldn't get walk-on parts, my mother picked up work as an extra for $25 a day and sought engagements as a lounge singer, but they meant late nights away from Daddy and me. When money was tight, we'd have to move in with John's mom, Betty, known as Mama, and her husband, George, known as Pa. I didn't mind it a bit because they treated me like a precious angel, which I loved. Meeting them was a huge shift in my life. The first time I met them, I was taken to their house one night and Mama came out onto the front porch, took one look at me and said, "So, this is my sweet baby?" They lived in a beautiful 3-bedroom house with a big garden and fruit trees in Miracle Mile. With them in our lives, being a Texan became a badge of honor. Mama was Texan, Pa was Texan, Daddy was Texan, and I think he always thought we might go back there to live one day. When my parents' work was steadier, we'd move instead to places like Crescent Heights Boulevard in the Hollywood Hills or to Laurel Canyon, where we had the first real family home that I can remember. A funky property off a steep, winding road called Lookout Mountain. North of Hollywood Boulevard, Laurel Canyon was a cheap district that attracted artists, musicians, and bohemians to its hillside bungalows and cottages. nestled between faded mansions. I was 5 years old when we first lived there. My babysitter by then was a Mexican teenager named Maria, whose job was to distract me from the distress of my parents going out at night. Every time they left the house, I'd throw myself on the floor and pitch a fit, kicking, crying, and screaming. I was young and I was terrified when they left at nighttime. I knew that things had changed and I was overreacting a gargantuan amount. Sometimes in the midst of these tantrums, I'd even ask myself, Cher, what the fuck are you doing? I know it was early for that word, but I was only ever around grown ups, so I heard it. They're just going to dinner, but I didn't understand that feeling of abandonment, even if it was an emotion I came to honestly. During the daylight hours, I was unbothered by those fears and instead had an adventurous streak. My favorite game to play with Maria was hide and seek. One afternoon, we decided to play it in the woods near our house. Excited, I skipped off barefoot as usual, determined to find a good hiding place so that Maria wouldn't find me right away. It was only when I'd roamed farther than ever before and found myself in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees that I realized I was lost. I couldn't hear Maria calling anymore, and the shadows were beginning to lengthen. Scared out of my cotton, little size 4 cotton underpants, I started calling her name in a scratchy voice. As my imagination conjured coyotes and mountain lions lurking in the bushes to gobble up this knee-high snack. I was probably lost for less than 20 minutes before Maria found me, but it seemed like days. My solution during the scariest or saddest moments of my childhood was to retreat inside my head. I think a part of me has been doing that ever since. Such was my imagination that I decided I was an angel sent from God whose mission was to cure polio, an infectious disease that caused paralysis and could kill children, who were the worst affected. News bulletins showed kids locked into breathing machines known as iron lungs, or bent out of shape and walking stiffly in ugly leather and metal leg braces. An early theory was that polio was carried by mosquitoes, so one day when mom caught me jumping around in a dirty puddle, she went nuts and her southern side came out. Cher, get out of there, I'm going to snatch your bald headed, she screamed, convinced I'd be infected and die. I was so obsessed with the idea that I was an angel sent to cure the disease that when Jonas Salk invented a vaccine, I was so pissed off. From angels, my imagination leapt to Jesus, because not long afterward I thought I saw Christ's face in the folds of my organdy bedroom curtains. Half asleep one morning, I looked up to see Jesus looking back down at me, and then he was gone. I should have said something, but I didn't, so I missed my chance to become Saint Cher. Being on my own with babysitters so often, as both my parents were working, I invented invisible friends that only I could see. Being the peculiar kid I was, I came up with Sam and Pete, two stubble-faced lumberjack truck drivers in jeans, plaid Pendleton shirts, and hats with flaps over their ears, though they didn't always wear their hats. They lived under the lemon tree in the backyard of Mama and Pa's house and dwarfed me with their presence. They were 100% real in my mind. I was just a kid, so where did I get that crazy idea? Once I had those two giants in my life, I was happy as a clam talking to them about everything from why men drank to our dream places to live. We never ran out of conversation. In my head, they lived with Mama and Pa, who never questioned my need for fantasy friends. Whenever I went to their house, I'd lay out a picnic under the lemon tree near the trapeze my grandmother had made for me out of clotheslines and broom handles, and we'd have the nicest little tea parties, drinking homemade lemonade and eating cherry tomatoes that I'd picked fresh from the vine that grew on the side of my grandmother's fence. When my mother saw me chattering away to thin air and found out about them, she freaked out, and it was Mama who calmed her down and told her not to be ridiculous. She is just a child, an only child. It's just a phase. With Sam and Pete by my side, I was no longer quite so lonely. Music was another refuge for my busy brain, and as a toddler, I loved to join in with my mother, who always sang in the house. I run around in my underpants, singing into my hairbrush, in tune with Mom. For years, whenever Grandpa Roy came for his annual visit from Oklahoma, and before he had that one drink too many, my Uncle Mickey would come over and we'd all sing together as a family. Roy, weak from years of alcoholism, could still play the hell out of a guitar, hee-hawing with glee all the while. That old man was a pistol and taught me many of my favorite tunes, like Hey Good Lookin' and Your Cheatin' Heart. I knew country music before any other kind, and the music of Hank Williams especially, known as the Hillbilly Shakespeare. Hank was immortal in our eyes. Movies were another big thing in my childhood, an infatuation I inherited from my mom. It began for me when my parents took me to see Dumbo at Grauman's Chinese Theater when I was 5. That historic landmark, built on Hollywood Boulevard nearly 20 years before I was born, was a paradise for a kid like me. It was as big as a city and as amazing to me as the Great Wall of China. It was everything you couldn't have an out-of-body experience in that magical place. You were never going to have one. Or if you couldn't there, you never were going to have one. Well, I hadn't been inside it, but I've been there. You know, where there's like handprints for like Marilyn Monroe and stuff, or the sign. Like there's the Walk of Fame too, but also at the theater. But I don't think I had an out-of-body experience. Going there for the first time in my patent Mary Jane shoes, I was speechless with excitement, not least because it had the most colossal candy counter in the history of the universe, with candy I didn't even know existed. Staring up at it through the glass, I was so overwhelmed I chose popcorn and a candy that I knew. We then followed a girl dressed in a beautiful Chinese costume into a red and gold theater so enormous that King Kong could have tap danced on the stage. The walls were flanked with huge columns, and there were paintings, statues, and ornate moldings, as well as an overhead light as big as a Buick. Having taken my seat next to Mom and Dad with my feet sticking straight out in front of me, I stared up in wonder when the lights were dimmed, the velvet curtains lifted as if by magic, and the music began. Then, miracle of miracles, images began flickering up on a giant screen. This was the first time I'd ever seen anything in color on a screen in my life. By the time the animals started singing and dancing, I was a goner. I was so lost in that movie that I thought it was real, especially the baby elephant with the oversized ears who was made fun of until he was given a magic feather and learned how to fly. I felt so completely at one with his character that I was right there alongside him. I can remember deciding I need to be up there. About halfway through the film, and after drinking too much Coke, I was desperate to use the bathroom but couldn't bear to leave my seat. Refusing to miss anything, I made the conscious decision not to go to the bathroom, even if it meant peeing my pants. Sitting in a wet patch for the rest of the show was a small price to pay to be in the presence of such greatness. Okay, I think we should end it there for the night. There's still a few pages left in this chapter, and we'll pick it up there on Sunday. But I just think that I'll especially remember her peeing in her seat at the theater, that I'll know exactly where I left off, because that's disgusting. She really liked Dumbo. This is why more movies need intermissions, no? I need to spit in my coffee.
All right, so we're doing call in tomorrow, and I'll be on live on the other site Saturday. So we'll continue this book on Sunday. I'm liking it so far. A lot of sad stuff with her mom and grandma, but her mom, it's going to be nice to see when her mom sees her like on TV and being successful, and she has her own baby. But I'm so interested in Sunny and Cher meeting Sunny, the beginning of the show, the like her thoughts, the cost of like that. I'm so excited for that. So anyway, we'll get to that. Forgot just how old she's. I know I was gonna say, oh, this would be a great movie, but I think it would be rude to do a movie about her life when she just had a Christmas album come out last year. She's made this book this year. Then there's part two to come. Like she's still working, she's still making music. So it's like I don't know. Like she's not like she's dead. Like I could see like the Elvis biopic because he's been dead since the 70s, but like she's still alive. But it just this like her that scene of her like in the orphanage like looking at the mom through the window like that's like such a movie scene, you know. So yesterday I did see that Kings of Tupelo. It was funny, it was interesting, it was just it's kind of light, you know, not it wasn't too if you're looking for something to watch it's like easy to be, you know. Well, yeah. And then there was something I was gonna try to watch tonight but now I can't remember what it is. We'll see if I remember. Anyway, I love you so much. Call me tomorrow. I got like 10 new games, so we have a lot of games ahead. It's going to be fun. Stay warm, stay cozy. Almost Christmas. Okay.